image you're looking at is from an incident that recently took place in Paris involving the famed or infamous Antifa. Now, a lot of people have been talking about Antifa. I'm going to talk about them too, although not too much to some degree. The primary thrust and focus of this video is the distinction between communism and fascism and why communism has so much more appeal as opposed to fascism. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But let's first talk about Antifa. Antifa is seen as a kind of what they, as they describe themselves, anti-fascist. Now, I was having a discussion recently with a friend, and we were pointing out, I guess mutually pointing out, that people oftentimes seem shocked that Antifa would be violent. I mean, they lit police officers on fire, and they've done other things. But if you look at the history of anti-fascist movements in Europe in particular, and I think a great example of that would be, the guerrilla fighters of the Spanish Revolution, who obviously, I wouldn't say they're identical to Antifa, but they certainly didn't like fascism. In fact, they did their best to fight against it. Now, this is interesting because you can see they were pretty violent. The Spanish Revolution was an incredibly violent event, and many, many people lost their lives in the process. Likewise, with the underground resistance in France during World War II. You can look back on the history of anti-fascism and see, if not the overt application of force and use of violence, in some cases somewhat justified, I guess, in terms of the invasion of France, you can certainly see that the kernel is there. It thus should not surprise anyone in today's day and age when so-called anti-fascists engage in violent activity. It's part of the nature of the movement. Of course, during Spain, there were kind of effectively anarcho-communists. It's not exactly the same thing, but the thrust is more or less the same. Now, I don't really have terribly much beyond that to say about Antifa, although clearly, as I said, shouldn't surprise anybody. Although I guess you could argue that modern-day Antifa is not as sort of sophisticated as the kind of anarcho-syndicalism, I think is what they would call themselves back in the day in Spain, as those guys or really anyone at the time. There were actual thinkers who fought in the Spanish Civil War. George Orwell is probably the luminary that first comes to mind, but obviously not a dumb guy. A guy who, at the time, was somewhat enamored of anarcho-syndicalism and wanted to get in on the action, but he wasn't dumb. I find myself very challenged to think of anyone in the contemporary scene, and maybe this is because I lack expertise in it, that could even come close to George Orwell's powers of perception, or even his general ability as a thinker, particularly of political thought and societal thought. And so, there are some analogies, but generally speaking, the violent thing should be the least surprising. Now, I do think that oftentimes, as is usually the case in politics, each side tries to polarize the other side. So there are elements that you can describe as left that are affiliated with Antifa, but generally speaking, progressives, as batty and loony as they are, won't go that far, although they sometimes are a hair's breadth away. So I don't think Antifa is necessarily coterminous with left-wing thinking in general. But it is a very, very strange thing to see these days when people are sort of surprised. Oh, look at them. Okay, enough on the Antifa subject. What I think is much more interesting and compelling, if you will, as a question is why communism seems to be everywhere and ubiquitous, and why fascism is, apart from the odd YouTuber, a relatively rare find in the current year of 2017. I think what we need to do is to look at fascism, as opposed to communism, as a kind of almost trend, a period piece, if you will. Thus, some of these concerns people have with sort of the rise of fascism, I think, are unfounded, because fascism arose in a time or place. Communism, by way of contrast, I would argue, is eternal. And I'll get into that in a bit as to why I'm making that statement. Communism is eternal. I obviously don't believe in communism, but it has an eternal quality to it. Fascism arose at a time when there was a huge push for nationalism and nationalized institutions, and all of these fascisms, whether it was the fascism of Franco, for example, Franco in Spain, or Franco, he was a big traditional conservative, and you couldn't necessarily say exactly the same thing of Mussolini and Hitler, for example. I don't think so. He had his own agenda, but that was fascist as well. But it was peculiar in particular to Spain, given Spain's unique circumstances and history and so on and so forth. The same you could argue with Mussolini. He tried to sort of resurrect the idea of the Roman Empire, although Italy had become a pale shadow of what it had been back in those times. And of course, Hitler had his own version of fascism. And none of these fascisms were necessarily interchangeable with each other. They were very, unique in some sense, and based on a time and period that gave rise to them. It was sort of the time of fascism. Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Fascist Party, I mean, his fascism was also different from the fascisms of other people. And so in no place and nowhere in history that you can observe can you see fascism as representative of something that is ubiquitous, eternal, and universal. And therein lies the rub, of course. The difference between fascism and communism is that fascism both make, as an ideology, both make grandiose promises, of course. And so fascism promises glory to the nation in question of sorts. Glory to the German nation, glory to Spain, glory to Italy, so on and so forth. Communism doesn't proclaim its glory to any one nation. It's universal. Communism, it's clear, I think anyone who has any idea about it, and I'm not going to call myself an expert on it, but I have some knowledge, it's just it's an earthly replacement for the claims of paradise offered by the religions of yore. I think that's quite obvious, in fact. Whereas fascism, any ideology can serve as a substitute. Fascism lacks the eternal promise. The reason why communists can continually reinvent the idea of its applicability and its universality is because of its universal appeal. So if communism failed in the Soviet Union and Cambodia and Cuba, or what have you, they can always say, well, that wasn't real communism, or that wasn't as it was intended to be. Because the real communism is, utopian, effectively. No place. It comes from the Greek utopia, as in no place. So you can never really course correct communism, because it doesn't actually exist in its perfected form. But it's always something that can be striven for, allegedly. And so you have that universal appeal. Even in the nuts and bolts, fascism, contrasting and comparing it, seems very different if you think about it. Fascism had specific goals. In the case of Germany, achieving certain claims to land, in terms of Lebensraum and other things, and specific goals in terms of ethnic purity or what have you. Communism just has this sort of idea that we can all sort of get along. That yes, violence can be used to achieve these ends, but eventually you'll arrive at some place where it's a good time and everyone's just chilling out. The promise of paradise is something that motivates people, and it shouldn't surprise us that communism has that angle in terms of appeal, and fascism doesn't, because it was confined to specific countries and specific times. Fascism is the product of an epoch whereas communism is also the product of an epoch while simultaneously appealing to certain universal human traits and desires. And that's something that fascism simply cannot compete with. Now, there's another element, apart from what are the qualities of these particular ideologies that drive people to and fro. That's a question, which I've explained. I think I've explored now, and I think it's answerable. We know communism has that universal appeal. It's universalist, whereas fascism is confined to specific epochs and specific countries, and are specific to those countries, the fascisms we encounter. But in terms of why people talk about these things more often than others, so people talk. Fascism is put in a much more negative light than communism, and actually, PragerU, the University of Prager, which is just a YouTube channel, obviously, had a video about what Dennis Prager was exploring the reasons why they do that. Of course, he had to play the Jew card and talk about the Holocaust. So he was engaging in the Holocaust industry, and I'll get to that in a bit. That's one of the reasons why you don't really find too many people comparing the two. But for one thing, there is no Holocaust industry when it comes to communism. The bodies of there are no representatives of the Ukrainian victims of the Holodomor. Or if there are, they're very few. And they certainly have never, if they've attempted to make an industry out of it, they've not been very successful. Likewise with the bodies in the killing fields of Cambodia or various African states where communism failed and didn't really work out. And of course in the Soviet Union itself and in China, and the list goes on and on. Obviously the body count, as Dennis Prager correctly pointed out in his particular video, is much higher for communism. But he does correctly cite that the quote-unquote Holocaust is the primary driving factor why people, which was quote-unquote unique and unparalleled in history. Well, I think that's debatable. That's not a debate that people can have in polite company. But I'm not here to debate the merits of the actual numbers and stats of the Holocaust. I'm more interested in the fact that the thereafter, as it were, because people, I think it was about in the 70s, you don't really see very much mention of World War II and the events there. Well, you do see some mention in public screeds, such as the New York Times. And you only start getting words like the Holocaust and World War II any great depth, and you can check this out. There is an archive online in the early 70s, perhaps the late 60s. Then it sort of builds up and it goes on from there. The communists have no such industry. I mean, it's people pushing a certain idea. The communists never had that. I mean, they have their universal appeal, but in terms of iniquity and evil, right? It's clear, in air quotes, that the events of World War II vis-a-vis fascism were, of course, far worse than those of communism. Of course, that's not the case. Not in terms of body count, although body count doesn't equal everything, but also in terms of brutality. The point that Dennis Prager missed in that video is that people just... The events of World War II have been turned into an industry. As Norman Finkelstein, I think, correctly pointed out many years ago. Many of you might know him. He's a Jewish guy who wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry. There are some other reasons, I think, why you don't hear too much about communism in a negative light. Now, I'm not one of these people that I think it's an incorrect description that describes communism as a Jewish movement. There were many Jews who participated in it, but that doesn't necessarily make it uniquely Jewish, because there are plenty of non-Jews who participated in it as well. However, there was Jewish involvement. There were Jews who were involved in it, and many Jews seem to have found appeal in that, to the point where they confiscated property of their fellow Jews. For example, Ayn Rand, who was a Jewish refugee from Russia, who had a completely, you could argue, oppositional philosophy to that of communism, in part, and no small part, due to the events that befell her and her family in Bolshevik Russia. Had her father's property had been confiscated, and they're sort of just driven out. And I mean, I guess you could say that the nature of the reactionary is something culturally Jewish, but specifically communism, I wouldn't argue that. So I'm not on board with that. But obviously, the fact that there are participants who had been Jewish in some of these movements creates a potential red herring that people who are promoting the ideology of anti-Semitism is everywhere would be afraid to examine, because they would think that everyone would jump the gun and just sort of get on that bandwagon, which is entirely true. Plenty of people do. They say, they'll just communism is Jewish and all Jews are communist. Like I said, I don't think that's a historically accurate depiction. But obviously, mentioning that and trying to explore the reasons why some Jews at the time did turn to communism is an interesting historical question, but one that is also off limits unless it's handled with the most delicate of kid gloves. So there are a number of reasons in terms of the ideological building blocks of each of these beliefs or philosophies, and at the same time as to why one appeals to more people than the other. But also the frame of light in which they've been put in subsequent years. Because, communism still sort of exists, but, the worst of communism and the worst of fascism took place during the 20th century. And so, in hindsight, one can look back on that and think, well, so fascism, because of things like the Holocaust industry and people's obsession with the events of World War II as committed by Germany as opposed to other forces, it certainly has taken on the appeal of the eternal evil, but it doesn't have the eternal good appeal for the reasons I cited earlier. And so, in closing, or as I approach my closing, clearly different things in these ideologies gave people different motivations. And fascism, it's almost like a period piece. It was a trend, a political trend, I think. And communism can withstand the crashing waves of the ages just because it appeals to everybody. And of course, as far as one being talked about more, they're sort of they're interconnected, because you can't really talk about communism without mentioning its universal appeal and the reason why so many people are willing to talk about it because of that, but also, I think, because of certain elements that have communist associations, although I wouldn't claim them to be uniquely communist in terms of essentialism. I think when talking about communism, a lot of people who are interested in these questions, they kind of commit the error of of what you would call Jewish essentialism, that there's something essential about Jewish culture and communism that sort of go hand in hand. And there's certainly a relationship there, but I don't know if the essentialist quality can be fitted in there. But yeah, it's just active suppression on the part of people who don't want to talk about these things. So, and the open elevation of what happened during World War II, whether you agree with the nitty-gritty details or not, how it's presented is the most important thing. It's sold as a product, and it is a product that is sold very well in terms of being evil. So fascism sold as as a effective evil product. Communism continues to sell as an effective good product, and that's pretty much all she wrote. Anyway, I hope that was interesting, enjoyable, something like that. And I will check you out later if I am still alive. And incidentally, I probably keep on forgetting to mention this. The bell icon, people keep on telling me that they've been mysteriously unsubbed to me and what have you, get messages every now and then. If you're not familiar with the bell icon right below the video, if you click that, you'll be notified when a new video is produced. And subsequently, if you have interest in checking out the video, that would be appreciated. So everyone take care, and with luck, I will check you out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.